Welcome to our series celebrating the Atlantic Fellows programs and the global community of Atlantic Fellows. These programs were the final big bet by Atlantic Philanthropies before drawing its grant-making to a close at the end of 2020. I'm Mary McDonnell, author of our founding story about how Atlantic Fellows programs came into being. For more than 2 decades, I worked with Atlantic Philanthropies on program development and evaluation strategies, including during the startup phase of the Fellows programs and their unifying hub, the Atlantic Institute. In 2022, during the annual global convening of Atlantic Fellows in Phuket, Thailand, I moderated a panel discussion between members of Atlantic's Board of Directors, Chair Peter Smitham, Deputy Chair Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot, and President and CEO Chris Oechsli. More about the panelists in a moment. First, some background on the Atlantic Fellows programs. The 7 Atlantic Fellows programs and the Atlantic Fellows community exists today due to the far-sighted generosity of Atlantic's founder, Chuck FEENEY, and his giving while living philosophy of philanthropy. But his generosity was complemented by the ingenuity, patience, commitment, vision, and incredibly hard work of Atlantic's board members and CEO, as well as that of their partners in host institutions. The panel discussion was an opportunity for the burgeoning Atlantic Fellows community to get to know board members as human beings, to demystify the people and the years-long process behind Atlantic's substantial investments that launched and today sustain these 7 programs, their global community, and the work of each Atlantic Fellow to promote a healthier, fairer, and more inclusive world. During our discussion, we also wanted to demonstrate the valuable role good philanthropic boards can play in the health and growth of the organizations they steward, when boards are committed, work hard, ask good questions, listen well, and empower and support leadership and grantees. Finally, we wanted to spend some time reflecting together on the origins of the Atlantic Fellows programs and the Atlantic community, in the hope that a deeper understanding of the history would inspire their common efforts to act together to meet their foundational and future challenges. Some of these challenges resulted from the way the programs were developed, some were new, and some emerged from each program's local context. Our founding story could necessarily capture only a small portion of what happened on the road from concept to reality. So this panel was an opportunity to go behind the scenes. What were board members thinking as they deliberated? What personal stories did they bring to the process? How might they reflect on some of their struggles? What were some of the challenges, obstacles, and lessons learned along the way? So let me introduce our panelists. Chris Oechsli worked closely with Chuck FEENEY in multiple senior leadership positions within the Atlantic companies and then the philanthropies. As president and CEO, he led the final phase of grant-making on a tight timeline, aiming to ensure that the foundation achieved the greatest possible impact with its remaining resources, and concluded its operations in 2020 as planned. Chris brought a deep appreciation for Chuck's and Atlantic's values and goals of promoting fairness, redressing inequities, and investing in those who had been excluded from opportunities. Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot is a MacArthur Prize-winning ethnographic sociologist, recipient of multiple honorary degrees, and an accomplished author with a lifelong commitment to work for equity and social justice. She brought to the board her deep understanding of human development, her empathy with the people developing the programs, and her concern for whether and how the fellows themselves were being transformed by the program experience. And finally, Board Chair Peter Smitham. Peter has a background in economics, business, and management. He brought experience in organizational development from his more than 30 years in private equity, where he focused on startups. And he brought his commitment to helping the vulnerable and disadvantaged through philanthropy. Peter always asked, was the infrastructure adequate? The host environment conducive? The structures and supports and people in place so that the program could be effective and sustainable? In the final phase, this was a small board, thoughtful, dedicated, probing, whose members journeyed alongside the programs. I began by asking Peter, what was it that the board was committed to making happen? so hard on?
We went through a phase around 2011 that was very, very difficult. The board really divided into two parts, and they had different visions for the future. I think one really captured Chuck's values, and the other tended to capture the values, equally valid, of other members of the board. The board shrunk from 16 or 17 to about 10, and there was a greater degree of involvement. The level of engagement was totally different. Sarah, a number of times, used expressions like, we don't want to go out with a whimper, we want to go out with a bang. We want to go out and do something that's incredibly meaningful, something where Atlantic will be known. At that point in time, in many countries in the world, we were seeing the opposite of ethical leadership. And Chris started bringing out these notions about leadership. We had Bridgespan doing work for us on leadership programs. So all of a sudden, it was the Big Bang, it was ethical leadership, but it was also pulling together the history of Atlantic. So we weren't going to go into new geographies. We weren't going to do new themes. We were actually going to integrate what we'd done and magnify it, really, really give it oomph. So we would choose a limited number of subjects where we would partner with the most credible people in the world. I can remember the first conversation when we started talking about Trinity College Dublin and University College San Francisco on the healthy aging mind. And I was mesmerized that people like that would come and collaborate with us and partnership with us. And I'm only choosing one example because I don't have a lot of time. But we were able to repeat that 7 times. Aboriginal rights in Australia and having the team from Melbourne University coming. So all of a sudden, this notion of ethical leadership started to rebound, but across a number of limited fields because the money we had. And we started to think about what a big bet actually meant. What was a long-term bet? Now, this brought in complexity. So when you're thinking about a grant that might run for 20 years, then all of a sudden, the questioning that you're doing of the host institutions takes a different frame. If it's one project and it's going to last a year, you can get your mind around that very, very quickly. This wasn't dating. This was marriage. This was generational change. So the intensity of the due diligence, the intensity of the processes that we put candidates through, in hindsight, probably was unfair. But at the time, I felt it was essential to do that so that we would be pairing with people that were there for the long term. We started to think, imagine all of those programs being capable of working together. So it wouldn't be one that was creating this ethical leadership and giving it a big push. All of a sudden, we've got 7 programs aligned, housed in the Atlantic Institute with the notion of Big Bang, ethical leadership, creating a forum where very, very talented, committed people were there knowing that they can and should make a difference. For me, it was the most exciting by a mile compared with anything I'd ever done before. That's me, Mary.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Sarah, let's look a little bit about how you went about reaching this dream. A number of these local programs were put inside large, bureaucratic, hierarchical academic institutions. Yet the programs embrace a culture of equity, fairness, flexibility, things that universities are not well known for. Can you talk a bit about how and why the universities became the default institutional homes for these fellows programs? What the benefits were that you were hoping for, and perhaps what some of the challenges you thought might emerge?
Well, I think that universities seemed like a natural nest for hosting the Atlantic Fellows programs because, first of all, of their stability. They were ongoing, continuous institutions with a great tradition. They had been there for a long time. Secondly, because they were resource-filled. They had lots of resources which we could use and which we could align with. Thirdly, because of the shared commitment. They were, like the Fellows programs, committed to the enterprise of teaching and learning. They were different in the sense that there was a commitment within universities to the focus on credentialing as one of the primary objectives, which I don't think was true of the Fellows programs. They also offered something which was sometimes elusive but important, and that is they offered a status in the wider ecology of education, that universities were places which had status. And they also offered us convening space, places to come together, to talk, to negotiate, places for discourse and exchange and critique. For some of us like me, who has spent the last 50 years of my professional life at a university, at Harvard University, universities were bureaucracies that felt familiar, that we understood, and we knew how to navigate them. We knew where to go to get things we wanted to get. So for all of these reasons, they seemed like an important institutional alliance, a good nest for hosting our programs. But there were also reasons why universities might prove to be inhospitable to our Atlantic Fellows programs. As one person put it, how do you successfully nest a nonprofit into the ecology of a highly bureaucratic university? So the Fellows programs were intentionally iterative, improvisational. They were meant to be nimble organizations that could adapt and change more quickly than these stodgy universities. They were also different in that they were activist in orientation. Most universities are not activist in orientation. They're about thinking, theorizing about theorizing, but not so much about bringing that theory into practice and having an impact. Very much from the very beginning, the Fellows program was activist. And our programs, the Fellows programs, were explicitly non-hierarchical, not bureaucratic or hierarchical. And we were engaged explicitly and purposefully in collective action. Another difference was that Fellows programs faced outward into the communities rather than universities where there was an inward focus and a distance between what my kids called the wide, wide world and what was going on in the academy. The Fellows program actually existed there to serve the community, to be responsive to the culture surrounding it, to the norms and the priorities of the communities that surrounded them. So this was a very, very different orientation outward. And although our programs were about learning and leadership, the program's focus was of a different kind of learning, not merely cognitive learning, not merely academic discourse, but also a kind of humanistic, humane learning that emphasizes curiosity, empathy, fairness, inclusivity, kindness, and I even heard the word grace spoken earlier in this conference. From my point of view, it was really learning about people's full capacity as human beings. And the learning, I think, also within the Fellows program that made it different from universities was that they are deeply political in the sense that Fellows are learning about power, its uses, its misuses, its abuses, and explicitly addressing and supporting those folks who are powerless, who are on the margins. So that was another difference, that universities, they're certainly sitting on power, they embody power, but they don't see themselves as political actors in the community. So there were these very different characteristics, structures, purposes, agendas, great contrast between universities on the one side and Fellows programs on another. So it's not surprising that even though universities appear to be good nests for our Atlantic Fellows programs, that the nesting of the nonprofit within the bureaucracy requires accommodations, requires compromises, requires mutual learning on both sides. And it wouldn't be surprising at all that there would be tensions, that there would be frictions, some resolvable and some unresolvable. It's my view that it isn't that we want universities and our Fellows programs to be absolutely aligned or even harmonious in their purpose, in their agendas, in their structures, in their characteristics. As a matter of fact, the contrast, I think, are very, very important until they get in the way of purposeful, productive action on either side. One other thing I would say is that I think that the identity of the Fellows programs is partly defined by the contrast with the university. That it is different, that it has a different purpose, makes it all the more clear what it is that the Fellows programs are doing and what they choose to do and what the dream, again, is about in the collective action.
Thank you. Let's talk about the other piece of this programmatic structure, the community. So, Chris, one of the things that I would often ask you as we were thinking about these programs was, would you be happy? Would you and the board and Atlantic and Chuck be happy if you ended up with 7 wonderful programs in 7 parts of the world that were thriving and producing fellows that were having impact, and if the community thing just didn't work out? And you always said no. The global community was a critical piece of this. It wasn't just about 7 programs in 7 places. Why was this idea of a global community a driving piece of the dream?
Let me say that it's an experiment, and it's a hypothesis, and it's one that has been inspired and informed by many of the people with us today. We've adopted and recognized the concept of Ubuntu, that we are who we are because of others. And these programs and this community evolved because of our discussions with people in this room and elsewhere. And in those discussions, there was an increasing recognition of some commonality of themes that cut across cultures and places and professions. So the notion of cross-program connectivity, awareness, interaction was increasingly evident as something that was a distinct value that could be made to these communities, which shared common values, orientations, and aspirations. Political fragmentation and the problems of governance, polarization, access to healthcare, issues of immigration, and what that does to communities. These are universal challenges that we face. I often use James Joyce's, the famous Irish writer's phrase of in the specific, the universal. And so bringing fellows into a space where they see with specificity what is happening in a particular environment and culture and can recognize their challenges in somebody else's space, if nothing else, produces an appreciation of solidarity and opportunity that extends beyond our immediate environments. The footprint for this was clearly Chuck Feeney's peripatetic lifestyle of moving around the world. And as Peter pointed out, it was towards the end of this process, as we developed individual programs, that we realized that we wanted to have some kind of structure, some kind of platform that would provide the opportunity to bring these programs together and to bring the fellows together after they had completed their respective programs. That, too, is still a work in progress. And one of the reasons we're gathered here with the fellows is to revisit what our hypothesis was in that regard and to identify ways in which the platforms that we've created can, in fact, support the community in ways that we hope. And I have to say, my mind after the last few days of exchange is just swimming with ideas and opportunities. So ask me this question again in a year or two. I am presently a little bit overwhelmed with the possibilities, but I think many of you here have seen those, and you know those, and most of the people in this room work across boundaries, cultures, and themes, and I think you can appreciate where those opportunities lie. But this is a call for your input into ways that we can make that more effective.
Thank you. Over the last few days, one of the common features has been a focus on values of different kinds. Of, I think, what Peter has called ethical leadership, and Sarah, humane learning and action. So there does seem to be this common thread across the programs that is around questions of values. And I'd be interested, Sarah, in unpacking that a little bit. As you were working to develop these programs, what was it that you thought would distinguish Atlantic Fellows from other leadership programs, other thematic master's programs on various forms of inequality?
You mentioned earlier that I was a MacArthur Fellow. The MacArthur Fellowships are very, very individual, and they are about individual creation and creativity and expression. And this seems to me, at its very core, a collective endeavor. I've talked about a humanistic, humane learning that underscores empathy, curiosity, fairness, equality, dignity for all. And these values are not only made explicit in the programs, but hopefully they are enacted and embodied in the people in the program. So they are not only individually held and expressed, but they are amplified, at least that was a hypothesis, by the collective. I think it's also true that these were values that are shaped by the cultural context. They were these universal themes across all the programs, but we knew that they would be expressed very differently in different cultural contexts. In other words, we interpret these central values in different ways given the cultural variations among us. So that the universal was there, but we were also interested in variation and diversity in the ways this was expressed and embodied in the programs. I think, too, at least what I considered very, very important and loved was that the values were also deeply embedded in the stories we tell about ourselves and our origins and our communities. One story leads to another story as people weave the webs of human connection. So through storytelling, through developing a narrative, both our individual narratives and our collective narrative, our institutional narratives, we are engaged in building this human connection. Chris talked about James Joyce. I always think about Eudora Welty, my favorite storyteller, who always says, I begin with the particular, never the general. And that's another way of her expressing this notion that in the particular resides the universal. Values are expressed as well, at least in this collective, in art form, in art, the music, the poetry, the dance, all of the senses, all of the art forms. As I looked at the videos of the vignettes from the first 3 days, I could feel the ways in which the collective was coming together through this expression of art, and art in so many different forms and cultural contexts. The ways that people were making deeply soulful connections, I felt, at least as they practiced and enacted the values embedded in these programs. I don't know of any other fellowship program that behaves in this way, where there are gatherings in this way that I've at least tried to describe here.
Yesterday, Chris, when you opened this convening, you said some of the people here you've known for 20 years, some you've known for 10 years. Most of the institutions that you decided to partner with, that you approached, that you thought about as potential partners, perhaps in the end were not partners. Most of these had been long-term Atlantic grantees. They had people in them whom you had worked with and who you knew, often who Chuck had known. But for Rhodes Trust, this was not the case. This had not been a long-term grantee. And there was at the same moment the controversies that Rhodes must fall and lots of things in the air that might have led you in a different direction. But you decided to host the Atlantic Institute, something that would try to achieve collective change at the Rhodes Trust. Can you talk a little bit about that thinking process that you went through in doing that?
As Peter said, as we began to explore how we could support the community of programs and what form that would take, and Peter and I share an operational perspective on what does that structure look like, how do you sustain it, Atlantic was committed and had plans to spend its money and disappear. That meant there had to be a platform that continued beyond the life of Atlantic. We spent a lot of time reflecting on what that should look like, including inventing and starting up our own Atlantic Institute organization in a standalone space. We considered looking, as we did with the programs, at other universities generally, and maybe finding an administrative home for that. I had worked with Sir John Hood, who was at the time chairing the Rhodes Trust when he was Vice Chancellor, University of Auckland, and he'd worked in the health area in Asia. And I went to him as part of our listening sessions about fellowships and experience in scholarships and fellowships, among many other organizations. And I was taken by what was happening within the Rhodes Trust and its orientation to continue to advance its scholar community based on values. It's always been a publicly spirited, publicly oriented effort to build scholars who would contribute not just in academic and technical ways, but in ways that were rooted in values, publicly oriented values. And there was also a movement afoot within the trust to think about how to harness the community of scholars, that this wasn't just a one-off DPhil degree program at a prestigious university. It was, what do you do with these 5,000 Rhodes scholars who have tremendous experience and skills and a publicly oriented motivation to make a difference in the world? 19th century language, fight the world's fight, but the concept was the same, this notion of how do we contribute to changing systems and historical systems. There's a lot of cloudy legacy with Cecil Rhodes the man, and this exploded in the middle of our discussions. The Rhodes must fall. This is the world we live in. These are the challenges our fellows need to navigate. We felt these were spaces where there would be contestation, where there would be discomfort, where there would be deep challenges to our established way of thinking. And we saw that as a plus. Sarah mentioned being at a prestigious location. Status is defined in different cultures in different ways, and we were not seeking necessarily to impose a northern version of status, but a university that's been a center of learning for 900 years brings something to the table. There is a lot of international ferment in that space, and even those fellows who are uncomfortable with walking into halls, that discomfort is part of the challenges that the fellows who are going to be influential and impactful need to understand, navigate, participate in. There's also a process of demystification. Being in halls of traditional power and even elite character that demystify and reorient someone to the work that they do without a sense of being second best or left out of some kind of elite vision of what the world can be. But more than that, we saw people oriented to similar values, investing in other people, with a view to building communities that would address some of the great challenges of our time. And in an environment that was very international, that had over a century of experience in investing in young people. It has been a really very positive and I think very successful partnership. And as I will say again, a continuing experiment.
Mm-hmm. And I think in a number of ways, this mirrors what's going on in the individual programs, where how to navigate diversity of perspective in respectful and constructive ways is really a part of each of the programs. And one of the things, as I've spoken to fellows, that they take away is that sort of maturing of their capacity to engage with ideas and people that they might not encounter in the micro work that they've been doing before coming to the program. So that might be a hallmark of what this community is about. I'm going to ask one more question, and I want to come back to the bigger picture. Peter, we're several years out now from the last board meeting and the final decisions to make these grants. Given what you know now, is there something you would have done differently? Something as a board that you would have wished you understood better or knew more about in order to increase the likelihood of success of this whole enterprise?
I want to go backwards, perhaps, to start the answer. When I think about organizations, I think about passion, energy, focus, competence, and organization. And I've looked at thousands of companies. And this model, if you like, carries me through lots of different places. Probably for the last 15 years or so, I've been very, very conscious about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are only coming out now in today's words, and they weren't the words that I used. But what it was really about was establishing whether the leaders really did have a vision, whether they really could convert the vision into a plan, whether they could convert the plan into actions and to people. So you're searching continually for this amalgam of characteristics, and it's very, very difficult to find them. So where I thought the challenge was difficult for the board was contemplating the notion that perhaps one of the programs wouldn't get to the level that we felt was sufficient to create liftoff. And therefore, I felt it might be difficult for people that had never been through a process of saying, we'd rather not give you any more money and we'd rather you not go any further. So that was the part of the process that I often wondered about. But what was wonderful to watch was as soon as we got to the conversations that perhaps suggested that one of the programs might not really have the full package of ideas and ability to deliver that was necessary, everybody on the Atlantic board got around the issue and didn't take the easy way out and say, let's scrap this one. It went into a form of overdrive. It went into, why can't we get people from one of the other programs to come and talk about this? Why can't we? Why can't we? Why can't we? So all of a sudden, the Atlantic, that I don't think had ever existed before, all of a sudden is in full flow, helping a program to meet the standards that we felt were necessary to give the money, which was based on a belief that for the next 20 years they would make it work. So that was for me the wonderful transition. Today, to use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion is fashionable, but I invest in lots of companies, and very, very few companies actually get their mind around that. Do we have female representation? Do we have people from different countries? Do we have people from different skills? We had a funny story in one of the programs where the program wanted to blend these skills together and to get a particular set of skills. I shouldn't talk about what they were, but they might have been a cartoonist. And this guy didn't have an undergraduate degree. And all of a sudden, the university is saying they didn't really want this person to take part. And for me, that was a fascinating exercise where the institution had values, and yet to make the program successful, we needed the combination of skills that might in some ways contradict the values of the university. And yet how quick the university were to see the benefits of the skills that this person could bring, even though perhaps he didn't have the necessary undergraduate qualification. So when I look back, Mary, I'm amazed that all of the initial choices came through. If you'd have asked me to bet at the beginning, what's the probability at looking at 5 startups and then coming to the conclusion that all of them have qualified, I'd have said to you at the beginning, I don't believe that. If we get to 3, I'll be happy. If I get to 4, I'll think it's wonderful. And the chance of 5 is just not there. And I think what it actually showed was the flexibility of the organizations. So when we were talking to Trinity or talking to UCSF or whichever ones we were talking to, they were getting these messages. They were understanding the need for adaptation in certain places. And that was fantastic. It wasn't what I expected. I expected institutional inertia, a lot of resistance, and we might be moving on to find another partner. If you'd have said to me at the beginning, would all of the programs have come through in the way that they've come through? And the first 2 or 3 years of their existence, would I have believed that they could have done this? My answer would be no. Your question was, what would we have done differently? This is a terrible question for me because my wife describes me as a perfectionist. So you should never ask Peter what we could do differently because he'll keep you up all night.
It's too late.
But the punchline in this question is the interaction, Mary, between the board and the staff and Bridgespan and the individual programs and the programs collectively exceeded any expectation that I had. It's just incredible to sit back now and look back and think of the hiccups which gave emotional tension. There were meetings, some of the Atlantic board meetings, where we didn't agree with each other. And that was often, and I think that's healthy. But I honestly can't think of anything I would have done differently. And I don't mean me as a person. I mean the Atlantic board, the Atlantic organizations, and the organizations that we worked with, both the implementing partners and the host. For me, it's been great. I don't say that often.
That was Atlantic Philanthropies Board Chair Peter Smitham concluding our panel discussion. I'm Mary McDonnell. You've been listening to our series celebrating the Atlantic Fellows programs and the global community of Atlantic Fellows. If you enjoyed the podcast, do share it on. You can hear podcasts about Atlantic Fellows and their work by going to the Atlantic Fellows YouTube channel or via our website at www.atlanticfellows.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.